Imagine this. You're walking down a suburban street in America. Every house has a lush green lawn, neatly trimmed and perfectly manicured. It looks beautiful, right? But here's the twist. While these lawns are thriving, the food we eat often travels thousands of miles to reach our plates. So why are we dedicating so much space and resources to grass instead of growing food? The thing is, lawns weren't always part of American life. They didn't even exist here until wealthy elites in the 18th century started copying the aristocratic gardens of England and France. Back then, a green lawn wasn't about beauty. It was about showing off. If you could afford to waste land on grass, a plant that produced nothing you could eat or sell, it meant you were rich. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson copied the style for their estates, and over time, the look spread into public parks designed by men like Frederick Law Olmsted, the guy behind Central Park in New York. Lawns became a kind of imported symbol of civilization, but ordinary people didn't have them yet. Everything changed in the mid-20th century. After World War II, the American dream shifted toward suburbs filled with identical homes. Government loans made buying houses easier, highways connected people to new neighborhoods, and developers like those who built Lakewood in California started selling not just homes, but a lifestyle. And in the middle of that lifestyle was a front yard covered in green grass. Magazines told people that a proper American family had a proper lawn. Ads for lawnmowers and fertilizers didn't just promise neat yards, they promised respectability. It became emotional. If you had a thick green lawn, you weren't just a homeowner. You were a modern, successful American. But here's the problem. A lawn looks simple, but it's a resource-hungry machine. The average yard can drink up to 10,000 gallons of water in a single summer. In California, that number jumps so high that some families use more water on grass than on everything else combined. Add to that the gasoline burned in lawnmowers, the fertilizers, the weed killers, the endless hours of trimming, edging, and spraying. All that effort just to keep alive a plant that nobody eats. Every summer, Americans pour millions of tons of chemicals onto their lawns, chemicals that run off into rivers and eventually into the ocean. Imagine what would happen if even a fraction of that energy went into growing food instead. This is where the comparison with Europe gets interesting. Because in much of Europe, especially in smaller countries or rural areas, people never stop seeing yards as potential gardens. In Germany or France, it's normal to see small kitchen gardens behind houses, growing lettuce, carrots, beans, or herbs. In the Balkans, especially in the former Yugoslavia, having a garden is almost expected. A typical house might have grapevines climbing over a terrace, tomato plants staked in rows, and peppers drying on the balcony. The grass, if there is any, is usually just a little patch where kids can kick a ball. But the rest of the yard? It's food. People there will tell you, why waste land on something you can't eat? It makes the American obsession look even stranger. Because Americans aren't blind to the problem, they just seem trapped in it. On Reddit, you'll find whole threads where people argue about lawns. Some call them green deserts, places that suck up water, chemicals, and time while giving nothing back. Others defend them as necessary for property values. One user joked that HOAS care more about the length of your grass than whether your kids have dinner on the table. Another pointed out the absurdity of neighbors complaining about a front yard vegetable patch, even when that patch produces food in a time when grocery prices keep rising. The arguments often come down to aesthetics versus practicality. And right now, aesthetics usually win. But let's pause and ask the simple question, what if all those resources, watering, mowing, spraying, even the weekends spent grooming the grass, were put into gardens instead? Imagine if every American home had a few raised beds of vegetables, some fruit trees, maybe berry bushes. Instead of 65 hours a year mowing, families could spend that time harvesting. Instead of fertilizer running off into rivers, compost could cycle nutrients back into the soil. Instead of using more water than 4 swimming pools just to keep grass alive, you'd be watering food that lands directly on your plate. The shift would be huge. not just for families, but for entire communities. Of course, it's not that simple. In many places, homeowners associations literally ban people from planting front yard gardens. There are horror stories of families being fined for growing tomatoes in neat rows, even when the garden looks cleaner than the neighbor's crabgrass. Developers and real estate agents argue that lawns keep neighborhoods uniform and attractive, which protects property values. And culturally, lawns are so ingrained in the American idea of success that breaking free feels rebellious. Some people even say that growing food in your yard makes the neighborhood look poor, which says a lot about the values that shaped this tradition in the first place. Yet the cracks are starting to show. Droughts in places like California and Arizona are forcing people to reconsider the wastefulness of grass. Cities are paying homeowners thousands of dollars to rip out lawns and replace them with drought-tolerant landscapes. And slowly, more families are experimenting with edible yards. The pandemic gave this movement a boost as people realized that food supply chains are fragile and that having a garden is not just a hobby but a form of security. Meanwhile, European-style gardens are being held up as examples of resilience and sustainability. In the Balkans, nobody needs convincing. A grandmother with her apron and hoe doesn't see gardening as radical. She sees it as life. Even a small patch of land can make a big difference. A modest 100-square-foot garden bed can produce hundreds of pounds of vegetables in a single season: tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, leafy greens, and herbs. Families can save hundreds, sometimes even over $1,000 per year on groceries just by growing what they need. And it's not only money. Having fresh homegrown produce means you control what goes on your food, reducing exposure to pesticides and improving nutrition. Imagine replacing a section of your lawn with raised beds full of vibrant vegetables. The impact on both your wallet and the environment can be surprisingly large. So where does that leave us? For some, the American dream will always be a house with a perfect lawn, neatly trimmed and bright green. For others, the dream might be a peach tree blooming in spring, a patch of cucumbers climbing a fence, or a row of sunflowers turning with the sun. Maybe the future is somewhere in between, yards that are beautiful but also productive, spaces that people can sit in, play in, and harvest from. The question isn't whether we can do it. The question is whether we're willing to let go of a tradition that at its heart was always about showing off. And maybe, just maybe, trade in that perfect green carpet for something that can actually feed us. Because when you think about it, isn't that the better dream?